The man who ruined everything walked into the wrong building on the wrong night, and the moment he crossed that threshold, every lie Alara Ashcroft had spent 8 years perfecting began to crack. Lucian Marrow didn't announce himself. He never did. He simply appeared in the doorway of the lantern shelf at 9:20 on a Tuesday, the closed sign already turned, the street outside empty and wet, and he looked at her the way a man looks at something he owns but hasn't bothered to collect yet. He smiled. That particular smile, patient, amused, absolute, and said, "He's going to find out, maybe tonight, maybe next week, but you should know. When he does, I won't be the one protecting you anymore." Then he left. Alara stood behind the counter for a long time after the door closed, her hands flat on the wood, her breath shallow. Upstairs, she could hear Rowan's sneakers hitting the floor as he moved around his room. 7 years old and already too perceptive for her comfort. Already asking questions she didn't have clean answers to. She thought, "I have maybe 48 hours. She was wrong. She had 3. Taj, if you've ever had to choose between the truth and the only life you've built, drop your city in the comments. Let me know where you're watching from. And if this story reaches you, if it finds you wherever you are, hit that like button and subscribe, because what happens next will change everything you think you understand about loyalty, blood, and the people we sacrifice ourselves to protect. Mom. The rain had been falling since mid-afternoon, the kind that didn't announce itself, just settled in and made everything heavier. Cassian Voss noticed it only because his left shoe had a small split along the inner sole that he'd been meaning to have replaced for 2 months, and the wet had worked its way through and his sock was cold. That's what he was thinking about when the first shot was fired. Not strategy. Not the meeting he'd just left on the 42nd floor of the Carver building, where 3 men he'd known for a decade had spent 90 minutes lying to his face about numbers that didn't add up. Not Lucien, who had sat across from him with that unreadable calm he'd always worn like a second jacket. Just the cold seam of water along his left foot, and the thought that he really needed to deal with that. The shot came from above, from the fire escape on the east side of the building. It hit the concrete pillar to his right and threw a spray of grit across his cheek, and then his body took over. 8 years of the kind of life that trains reflexes past conscious thought, and he was moving before the sound had finished echoing off the buildings. He didn't go back to the car. The car was compromised. They'd have people on it. He went left, then left again, cutting through the kind of narrow service alley that smells like old grease and wet cardboard, coming out onto a street he didn't immediately recognize. The waterfront district. He'd been pushed further east than he intended. There was blood on his left hand from somewhere, a graze maybe, or the concrete shrapnel, and he pressed it against the inside of his coat and kept moving. 2 pursuers. He'd counted footsteps. One of them was faster, trained, keeping pace 3 blocks back. The other had gone wide, trying to cut him off. He turned down a side street lined with small storefronts, most of them dark. A bakery with the lights still on in the back. An old clock shop with a sign in the window that had faded to near illegibility. And between them, pushed back slightly from the sidewalk as if it had always been slightly reluctant to be found, a narrow bookstore. The lantern shelf, a warm amber light in the window, a small hand-painted sign, and through the glass, the silhouette of someone moving behind a counter. He didn't think. He pushed the door open. The bell above the door was soft, old brass, the kind that doesn't clang so much as murmur, and the smell of the place hit him before anything else. Old paper, candle wax, coffee from somewhere in the back. It was the kind of smell that reaches past the thinking part of your brain and grabs something older, and for one unguarded second, Cassian Voss forgot entirely what he was running from. Then the woman behind the counter looked up. He would think about that moment later, the specific geography of it, the half-second before recognition, the way her face was entirely open and then entirely closed, all in the time it takes to blink. She was wearing a dark green cardigan, her dark hair pulled back loosely, a pencil tucked above her ear. She had a book open on the counter in front of her, and she'd been marking something in the margin. Her eyes, when they landed on him, went very still. Alara Ashcroft. 8 years. 8 years, and she looked, not the same, that wasn't the right word. She looked like someone who had lived 8 years, which is different from someone who has merely passed through them. There were small differences, the kind that accumulate slowly and are only visible all at once after an absence. But the eyes were exactly what he remembered, careful, direct, the kind of eyes that see more than they show. She said, "Can I help you?" 3 words, flat, professional. The voice of someone who had never seen him before in her life. Cassian was bleeding through his coat lining, and there were 2 men somewhere in the streets outside who'd been paid to put bullets in him, and the only thing he was actually processing was the fact that Elara Ashcroft had just looked at him like he was a stranger. He stepped further into the store. The door swung shut behind him. "Elara, the store is closed," she said. She hadn't moved. Her hands were still on the book, but she wasn't looking at it anymore. She was watching him with a careful precision that he recognized. She was calculating something. Distance, maybe. Options. "I know it's closed." He kept his voice low. His heart was doing something irregular. "I'm not here to buy a book." "Then I'd suggest you leave." "I got shot at tonight." He said it flatly, the way you state a logistical fact. "I went left instead of right. I ended up here." He paused. "I didn't plan this." Something moved behind her eyes. Not softness, something more complicated than softness. She opened her mouth to speak, and that's when the door to the back of the store banged open and a small boy came through it at speed, the way children move when they're pursuing something with total commitment and no awareness of obstacles. He was maybe 6, maybe 7. Dark sneakers, one lace untied. A paperback clutched against his chest. He'd been running, clearly, and he pulled up short when he registered that someone unfamiliar was standing in his store. The boy put himself directly in front of Elara. Not beside her, not near her, in front of her. The gesture was so instinctive, so immediate, a child's version of what bodyguards spend years learning to replicate, that Cassian went very still. The boy stared at him with an expression that was 9 parts suspicion and 1 part the particular courage of someone who hasn't yet learned how frightening the world can be. "Who are you?" the boy said. Cassian didn't answer immediately. He was looking at the boy's eyes, pale, icy, a very specific shade of blue that he had only ever seen in 2 places, old photographs of his father and his own reflection. "Rowan." Elara's hand came to rest on the boy's shoulder. Her voice was steady, deliberately steady in the way that steadiness requires effort. "Go back upstairs. There's a man in the store. I can see that. Go upstairs." "But now please." The boy, Rowan, looked at her, then back at Cassian. He was doing the thing children do when they're trying to read a situation that the adults in the room are working hard to hide. His eyes were sharp, sharper than a 7-year-old's eyes should be, maybe. He held Cassian's gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable, and then he turned and disappeared back through the door without another word. The silence after he left had weight. Elara said nothing. She waited. Cassian's voice, when he found it, came out quieter than he intended. "How old is he?" "You need to leave." "Elara, you're bleeding on my floor." She said it without inflection. "I'm going to ask you one more time to leave, and if you don't, I'm going to call someone who will make you leave, and neither of us wants that." A beat. "Go." He looked at her. He looked at the door where the boy had gone. The numbers were simple. They'd been simple the moment he saw those eyes, but simple doesn't mean easy, and the thing about Cassian Voss, the thing that most people who'd spent time fearing him would have found startling, was that there were moments when he simply didn't know what to do. This was one of them. He went to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame. He said without turning, "I'll come back." "Don't." He stepped out into the rain. The 2 men who'd been following him had lost the trail somewhere in the alley system. He walked 6 blocks north and made a call from a number they wouldn't recognize, and within 20 minutes a car arrived and he was out of the waterfront district and back in the city's ordered geography. He sat in the back seat with his coat pressed against his hand and looked out the window at the rain-slicked streets and said nothing. His driver, a careful man named Soto, who had been with the Voss organization for 11 years and who understood that certain silences were not to be interrupted, said nothing either. Cassian thought about a pair of pale blue eyes. He thought about the way a 7-year-old boy had stepped in front of his mother without being asked, without thinking about it. Just done it. The way certain things are simply in you before you have the language for them. He thought about 8 years. He had learned, over the past decade, to treat most things as problems to be solved. It was a useful framework. It kept emotion out of the machinery and let him make the kinds of decisions that the Voss Syndicate required him to make. Cold, calibrated. He had built an entire architecture of himself around that framework. It had never accounted for a tiny bookstore between a bakery and a clock shop. He pulled out his phone. Not to make a call, to look at it. He had a number for Alara. He'd always had a number for Alara, carried across every burner phone, every replaced device, 8 years of keeping it as a kind of deliberate wound, a thing he pressed on occasionally to confirm it still hurt. He'd never used it. He put the phone back in his pocket. Soto. Sir, I need everything there is on a property in the waterfront district. Small bookstore. The lantern shelf. A pause. And I need to know about the surveillance teams. Soto's eyes shifted briefly in the rearview mirror. Surveillance teams. On the building. Someone's running protection on that store. I want to know who. Soto said nothing, which was the correct response. He simply drove. Cassian watched the city move past the windows and tried to construct a logical sequence. 8 years ago, Alara Ashcroft had disappeared. He'd searched. Not at first, not immediately, because at first he'd told himself she had the right to leave. That people leave. That whatever they'd had was a thing with an end in it, and he'd swallowed that and kept moving. But then the absence had calcified into something harder, and he'd looked, quietly, carefully. He'd found nothing. Not nothing in the sense of no traces. Nothing in the sense of traces that led nowhere, as if someone had been very deliberate about erasing the path. He'd eventually stopped looking. He wasn't proud of that. He told himself it was respect for her choice, but there is a difference between respecting someone's choice and being afraid of what you might find, and he had never been entirely honest with himself about which one it was. Now there was a boy named Rowan, with a certain shade of eyes, and armed men who were quietly, professionally running surveillance on a bookstore in the waterfront district, which meant someone knew that store mattered, and someone had decided to keep watch on it without Cassian's knowledge. The car moved through the rain. Cassian's hand had stopped bleeding. He pressed his thumb against the gash and thought, Lucienne. He didn't know why the name surfaced then, only that it did. Meet Sam. Back at the building on Marsh Street, not Syndicate headquarters, which was a designation the organization had always resisted, but the closest thing to it, the 16th floor of a converted textile warehouse that served as the operational center for Cassian's legitimate and less legitimate concerns, he sat in the outer office while his hand was cleaned and bandaged by a man named Pryor, who had been a field medic before he became whatever he was now. Pryor worked without asking questions. Another person who understood certain silences. Lucian Marrow arrived 20 minutes later. He was 53, lean and precise in the way of someone who has trained their body the way they have trained their mind, as an instrument of function rather than an expression of anything. He wore a dark gray suit that was probably expensive and looked as though it had never been anything but perfectly placed. He'd been Cassian's father's consigliere before he'd been Cassian's, and he carried that history the way a stone carries the shape of the water that wore it. He looked at Cassian's hand and said, "The Balcroft team. We identified 2 of them. Third shooter is still unconfirmed. The Balcroft family." Cassian tested the name. That's a significant step for them. They've had pressure recently, shipment losses. They're looking for a way to accelerate certain outcomes. Lucien sat in the chair across from the desk with the particular ease of someone who has sat in that chair 10,000 times and never found it uncomfortable. It was opportunistic. The meeting schedule leaked. We'll find the source. We always do. Cassian's voice was even. He was watching Lucien's hands, a habit he'd developed years ago. Not suspicious exactly, just attentive. Lucien's hands rarely gave anything away. That was itself a kind of data. I need a research request put through quietly. The waterfront district. A bookstore. The lantern shelf. Property records, business filings, ownership history. Lucian's expression didn't change. He nodded once. Personal interest? Call it due diligence. Cassian held the man's gaze. And I want to know about any protection details operating in that neighborhood that I haven't authorized. A beat. Small. So small that a less attentive person would not have registered it. Then, of course. Tonight, Lucien. Understood. After Lucien left, Cassian sat alone for a while. The building settled around him. Somewhere below, the city went on being itself. Its commerce and its violence and its 10,000 ordinary lives rubbing against each other in the dark. He had spent a long time believing himself to be above the ordinary, or at least outside it. Separate. The machinery by which certain things happened. He was 38 years old. He had a son he'd never known existed. He looked at his bandaged hand. He thought about a boy who stepped in front of his mother and asked, "Who are you?" The question didn't have a short answer. He went back the next morning. He told himself he wasn't going to. He told himself he needed more information first, that going back without a clear objective was tactically unsound, that Alara had told him not to return, and there was a version of respect that honored that. He told himself all of this, and then he put on a coat that didn't have blood in it and walked to the waterfront district because he was, in the end, incapable of staying away. The lantern shelf opened at 9. He was there at 8:50, standing across the street under a narrow awning, watching. Alara arrived at 8:45. She came from the north, walking quickly, a canvas bag on one shoulder and a coffee in her hand. She had her hair down today. She unlocked the front door without looking up, disappeared inside. And 2 minutes later, the lights came on. At 9:15, Rowan came down the exterior staircase that ran up the side of the building, the apartment above the shop, clearly, wearing a school bag and the expression of someone who was not fully conscious yet. He stopped at the bottom of the stairs and said something back up toward an open window. A pause. Then he headed east toward what Cassian assumed was a school. Cassian watched the boy walk down the street. He walked the way certain people walk, with a slight forward lean like he was already thinking about wherever he was going. He was 7. He was walking to school alone, which meant either Alara trusted the neighborhood or the neighborhood had been made safe. Cassian thought, the surveillance teams. He crossed the street and pushed open the door. Alara was behind the counter. She looked up. The expression that crossed her face lasted less than a second, and then was gone, replaced by something careful and controlled. "I told you not to come back." "I know." He closed the door behind him. The store was empty except for them. "I need to ask you something." "I don't owe you anything." "No," he said. "You don't." She waited. Her hands were on the counter again, flat, which he was beginning to recognize as a tell. Not nervousness exactly, but a way of anchoring herself, of making sure she was still standing on solid ground. "How old is he?" "Cassian." "How old, Alara?" She looked at him for a long moment. The radiator in the corner ticked. Somewhere upstairs something settled. She said, 7. He did the arithmetic. He had already done the arithmetic 18 times since last night. He did it again anyway, the way you press on a bruise to confirm it's real. "You should have told me." "Should I have?" Her voice was very quiet, not a question. "He's my son." "He is my son," she said. "He has always been my son. He has grown up in this store, in this neighborhood, with a mother who is here every single day and friends, and a school he loves, and a life that is entirely his own. He has that because I made choices." Her eyes didn't move from his. "You don't get to walk in here because you happened to turn left instead of right last night and tell me what I should have done." The anger in her voice was old, the kind of anger that has been refined over years until it has lost any heat and become something colder and more precise. He recognized it. He'd heard that specific quality in voices before, people who'd been wronged a long time ago and had spent the interval getting very clear about it. He said, "Tell me why." "Why what?" "Why you left. I need to hear it from you, not records, not sources." He stepped closer, not in threat, just in the need to reduce the distance between what he was saying and what he needed her to hear. Tell me what happened 8 years ago. Alara Ashcroft looked at him, and something in her face shifted. Not opened. More like the moment before something opens, when you can see it considering the possibility. She said, Cassian, if I tell you what happened 8 years ago, everything changes. It's already changed. She looked at the door. She looked at the stairs that led up to the apartment where her son had slept. She picked up her coffee cup and put it back down without drinking from it. Close the blinds, she said finally, and then sit down. He did, and she began to talk. She didn't start at the beginning. People who have carried something heavy for a long time rarely do. They start where the weight became unbearable and work outward from there. She started with a phone call. 8 years ago, 3 weeks after you left for the Carver negotiations, the ones that ran long, the ones you said would take 2 weeks and took 6. I got a call from a man I didn't know. He told me he worked for you. He said you'd sent him. She paused. Her hands were flat on the counter. She wasn't looking at Cassian. She was looking at the middle distance, the way people look when they're replaying something they've reviewed so many times the footage has worn thin. He said you'd found out about the pregnancy. Cassian said nothing. He was very still. He said, and I remember the exact words. I've had 8 years to remember the exact words. He said, Mr. Voss wants you to understand that the situation has become complicated. He's asking you to leave the city quietly. He's made arrangements. If you don't use them, the alternative is considerably less comfortable. The radiator ticked. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled past. I didn't believe him at first, Alara said. I called your number 4 times. No answer. She finally looked at Cassian. Her eyes were dry. Whatever grief had lived in this story, she had processed it long ago into something else, something harder and more functional. Then I got a package, delivered to the apartment. Inside was a phone. On that phone was a voice recording. She stopped. Cassian said, What was on it? Your voice. She watched him carefully. Saying that the pregnancy was a problem, that you couldn't have that kind of complication during the Carver negotiations, that it needed to be handled. A beat. You sounded very calm. He felt something move through his chest that wasn't quite any emotion he had a clean word for. That recording doesn't exist. I know that now. Alara? I know that now, she said again, with a quiet emphasis that made it clear she was not interested in his denial as a defense, only as a data point she'd already accounted for. At the time, I was 29 years old, 7 weeks pregnant, and the man I loved had just sent someone to my door to deliver a threat, and I had a recording, in your voice. She picked up the coffee cup again, set it down. What would you have done? He didn't answer that. There was no answer that wasn't a kind of violence. I used the arrangements, she said. I left. I built a life. I had Rowan. She squared her shoulders slightly, an almost invisible adjustment, the movement of someone who has been sitting inside a difficult thing and is now deciding to come back out of it. For 3 years, I moved constantly. Then I found this neighborhood, this building, and I stopped. I opened the store. I put down roots because Rowan needed roots, and I decided that whoever came for us, I was done running from them. Who came for you? Cassian said. The surveillance teams. She looked at him. Outside. Running perimeter on this building every night. Professional, disciplined, not local. He held her gaze. Someone has been protecting this store, and it wasn't me. A silence opened up between them that was different from the earlier ones. This one had something sharp in it. I don't know who they are, Alara said, and for the first time since he'd walked in, her voice had an uncertainty in it that wasn't controlled. They appeared about 18 months ago. No contact, no introduction. They're just there. You didn't find that alarming? Of course I found it alarming. I also found it useful, and I was raising a child alone, and I made a calculation. Her jaw tightened. Don't look at me like that. I'm not looking at you like anything. You're looking at me like I made a mistake. I'm looking at you, he said carefully, like someone who is trying to understand a situation that has significantly more moving parts than I was aware of 48 hours ago. He leaned forward slightly. Someone staged that recording. Someone sent that man to your door. Someone built an entire fiction that sent you running for 8 years. And now someone is running a protection detail on your building that neither of us authorized. He paused. Those aren't separate problems. She stared at him. Those are all the same person, he said. He left the store at 11. He didn't want to leave. That was the uncomfortable truth of it, the thing he didn't examine too carefully. The fact that standing in that narrow bookstore with its amber light and its smell of old paper was the first place he'd felt something close to oriented in a very long time. But Rowan would be home from school by 3:15, and he needed to be gone before that happened. Alara had made that clear without saying it, and he had understood. He called Soto from the street. The research request. What have we got? Ownership is clean. She's had the property for 5 years, purchased outright. Business filings are current, no outstanding liens. A pause. The surveillance teams are more interesting. Talk. 3-person rotations, 12-hour shifts. The equipment they're running is not available commercially. Soto's voice was careful, the way it got when he was delivering information he understood to be significant. We ran the registration on 2 vehicles we identified in the area. Both came back to a shell company, Meridian Consulting. Meridian traces back through 4 more shells before it disappears into a holding structure in the Cayman Islands. Cassian stopped walking. The holding structure, Soto continued, sits adjacent to a series of accounts that were established by your father's estate. The street noise continued around him. A woman pushed a stroller past. A cab honked somewhere to his left. You're telling me, Cassian said, that my father's money is paying for surveillance on that store. I'm telling you the financial architecture points in that direction. I can't give you certainty without deeper access. Get deeper access. Surface, tonight, Soto. He ended the call and stood on the sidewalk for a moment with his phone in his hand. His father, Aldrich Voss, had been dead for 4 years. Heart failure, officially. The old man had been 71, had smoked for 40 years, had run a criminal empire with the casual iron certainty of someone who genuinely believed the rules of mortality were negotiable until they weren't. The estate had transferred to Cassian cleanly, or so he had believed. The accounts, the holdings, the structures both visible and less visible. Apparently not all of them. He thought about Rowan, about a 7-year-old with a particular shade of eyes, about the fact that Aldrich Voss, who had spent his entire life building something he called a legacy, had apparently known about his grandson for how long? Long enough to set up a protection detail, long enough to build a financial architecture around it, long enough to say nothing to his own son. He started walking again. He needed to think, and he thought best when he was moving, always had, the physical rhythm of it doing something to the cognitive machinery that sitting at a desk couldn't replicate. He walked north, then east, covering ground without particular destination, and he thought about his father, and about the word legacy, and about the way old men sometimes decided that keeping secrets was a form of love. It wasn't. He knew that now, with a clarity he couldn't have managed 10 years ago. Keeping secrets is a form of control. The love story is just the justification you dress it in. Lucien Marrow's office was on the 14th floor. It was a corner room, which Cassian had offered him, and which Lucien had accepted without comment, as he accepted most things, as if they were simply the natural order arriving on schedule. He had a view of the river on one side and the city on the other, and he kept the blinds at a precise 45 degrees, enough to let in light without permitting visibility. Cassian came in without knocking, which was not unusual. Lucien was at his desk. He looked up from a document he was reviewing. His expression was its customary thing, neutral, attentive, calibrated to whatever register the room required. The Meridian Consulting accounts, Cassian said. A pause. Barely measurable. Less than a second. But Cassian had known this man for 20 years, and he caught it the way you catch a single wrong note in a piece of music you've heard 1,000 times. I'll need more context, Lucien said. No, you won't. Cassian sat down across from him. Not aggressively, just with the particular settled quality of someone who has decided to be here for a while. The accounts trace back to my father's estate. I want to know what they were established for and who has been managing them. That's a significant audit request. It'll take time to... Lucien. He said the name quietly. That was usually enough. I'm not asking you to audit anything. I'm asking you what you know. Lucien set down his pen. He folded his hands on the desk. He looked at Cassian with the expression of a man choosing, very deliberately, what to put on his face. Your father maintained certain private arrangements, he said. He was meticulous about separation. Some structures weren't integrated into the main estate for reasons of security. I was aware of their existence in a general sense. The specifics were his. He didn't fully disclose them before he died. That's not unusual for men in his position. And it didn't occur to you, Cassian said, to mention to me that there were financial structures I wasn't aware of, connected to my family's name being actively used to fund surveillance operations I hadn't authorized. Lucien's hands remained folded. I didn't have confirmation they were actively funded until relatively recently. How recently? 6 months ago. 6 months. Cassian's voice didn't change. And in 6 months, you didn't bring it to me. I was trying to understand the full scope before... Lucien. Quieter now. Stop. The word landed in the room and stayed there. Lucien looked at him, and for the first time in the 20 years Cassian had known this man, he saw something in those carefully arranged features that he had never seen before. Not fear exactly, more like the recognition that a particular door had just been reached. Who was the man, Cassian said, who went to Alara Ashcroft 8 years ago? Nothing moved in Lucien's face. That was the tell. A truly uninvolved person would have furrowed a brow, would have asked, Alara who? Lucien Marrow said nothing, and his face said nothing, and that was everything. Cassian stood up slowly. He pushed the chair back with the backs of his knees and stood there for a moment, looking at the man who had sat across from him at every significant table for 2 decades, his father's most trusted instrument, the person who had managed the syndicate's most sensitive operations with a precision that Cassian had always quietly admired, had modeled himself on, had considered the gold standard of a certain kind of professionalism. He said, "We're going to have a different kind of conversation soon. I want you to understand that." Lucien said, "Cassian, not now." He moved to the door. "Get me the Meridian records by end of day. All of them. Every account, every transaction, every payroll line." He stopped at the threshold without turning around. "And Lucien, if anything is missing when I look at them, I'll know you made a choice, and I'll treat it accordingly." He left the office. He didn't look back. He was at his desk on the 16th floor when Soto called at 2:40 in the afternoon with a voice that had lost its careful neutrality. "We have a problem." "Tell me." "The deeper financial access you requested, I pulled the full Meridian structure." A pause. "Cassian, this isn't just a surveillance operation. The accounts have been active for 7 years. Consistent monthly transfers to 6 different organizations. 2 private security firms, 1 legal firm, 1 medical group, and 2 entities I haven't identified yet. The total expenditure over 7 years is..." Soto stopped. "It's significant." "How significant?" "North of $14 million. He set down the pen he was holding. $14 million spent over 7 years protecting a bookstore. "Protecting something connected to that address," Soto said. "The legal firm is interesting. They've been filing documents periodically, sealed filings, a jurisdiction I don't have immediate access to. And the medical group..." Another pause. "They're a genetic research group, specialized. The kind of work they do is biometric, hereditary profiling." The word landed in Cassian's chest like something thrown hard. "Biometric," he said. "Bloodline verification, identity authentication through genetic markers." Soto's voice was steady and precise in the way it got when he was delivering information he understood was catastrophic and was choosing professionalism as his method of getting through it. "Your father's estate, the global financial holdings, the ones that never fully transferred." "Say it," Cassian said. "I think there's a lock," Soto said, "and I think the key is the boy." Jatib. He drove to the waterfront himself. He didn't call ahead. There wasn't time for that, or he told himself there wasn't time, which might have been the same thing or might not have been. He was at the store by 3:40. Rowan would already be home. He pushed through the door. The bell murmured. Rowan was at a table near the back of the store, doing homework. He had a pencil in his left hand, same hand Cassian used, and he was frowning at a worksheet with the concentrated displeasure of someone who found the problem insufficiently interesting rather than too difficult. He looked up when the bell sounded. He looked at Cassian without speaking for a moment. Then he said, "You were here yesterday." "I was." "Mom said you were a customer." "I know she did." Rowan considered this. He had the kind of face that processed things visibly. Not slowly, just honestly. You could watch him think. "That wasn't true," he said. Cassian crouched down so he wasn't looking at the boy from above. It put them closer to eye level. "No," he said. "It wasn't." Rowan looked at him with those pale, precise eyes, and Cassian felt something in his chest that had no clean name, something that was made of time and waste and the particular grief of irreversibility. "Who are you?" Rowan said. Same question as the first night, quieter this time. Alara came through the back door. She saw Cassian crouched at her son's table, and her face went through several things in rapid succession. Alarm, calculation, something that was neither of those. "Rowan," she said, "will you go upstairs and start on your reading?" "I'm doing math." "Math can wait." The boy looked between them. He was doing it again, that reading of the room, the picking up of frequencies adults believed they were transmitting on channels too high for children. He picked up his worksheet and his pencil and went to the stairs without argument, but he paused at the bottom step. He said to Cassian, "You have the same eyes as me." Then he went upstairs. The store held the silence for a moment after his footsteps faded. Then Alara said, "Why are you here?" Cassian stood up. "I need you to listen to me, and I need you to take what I'm about to tell you seriously." He met her eyes. "The people watching this building, they're not just here because of you. They're here because of Rowan, because of what Rowan represents." She went very still. "My father," he said, "he built something. Over decades. A financial structure, global, layered, deliberately obscured, and at some point, I don't know when, I don't know how, he found out about Rowan, and he built a lock." He watched her face carefully. "The kind of lock that requires a key, a biological key, a bloodline." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying my father encoded control of a significant portion of the syndicate's hidden financial empire into a biometric system. A system that requires direct genetic verification from his bloodline to access." He paused. "Rowan is the last living direct descendant." Alara's hand found the edge of the nearest bookshelf. She gripped it. "How long have people known this?" she asked, and her voice was very quiet. "I don't know," Cassian said, "but I know at least one person has known for a long time. Long enough to arrange the surveillance. Long enough to have been the one who arranged your disappearance 8 years ago." He watched her. "They needed you gone. They needed you and Rowan contained, protected and monitored, but separate from me, separate from the syndicate. Waiting." "Waiting for what?" "For Rowan to be old enough." She let go of the shelf. She crossed the room to the window and looked out at the street, and he watched her shoulders work through something. Not breakdown. Alara Ashcroft was not a person who broke down, but a reorganization of something internal, a recalibration under pressure. "Get out," she said. "Alara, not because I don't believe you." She turned from the window. Her eyes were dry and furious and afraid in a way she was not entirely managing to conceal. "Because my son is upstairs and I need 10 minutes to think before I say anything else to you, and I cannot do that while you're standing in my store." He nodded. He moved to the door. "Cassian." Her voice stopped him. He turned. She was looking at him with an expression he hadn't seen before. Not the anger from this morning, not the controlled grief from the story she'd told him. Something raw, something that had just been made, just in this moment. "If you're right, if someone has been watching us for 7 years, managing us, moving us like pieces, then your coming here last night wasn't an accident." He looked at her. "Someone let you get shot at," she said. "Someone let you run in the wrong direction. Someone made sure you ended up on this street." Her voice was very steady. You didn't find me by accident. Someone pointed you here. And I want to know why now. What's changed? Why is now the moment they decided you needed to find us? He stood in the doorway for a moment, the street behind him, the amber light of the store in front of him, and he turned the question over, and he found, in the turning, that he had no answer that didn't lead to something he wasn't ready to name yet. 10 minutes, he said. He stepped outside. He was standing on the pavement, turning Alara's question over in his mind, when his phone rang. Soto. He answered. We have a situation. Soto's voice was stripped of everything except information. An hour ago, 2 men entered the Carver building. They went to the 42nd floor, the room where you met last night. A pause. They weren't looking for you. They were looking for documentation. Specifically, the biometric access protocols your father's lawyers filed under seal 17 years ago. Cassian said nothing. Someone is moving fast, Soto said. Someone who already knows where the protocols are. Someone who's been waiting for exactly this moment and has now decided the waiting is over. Another pause. Cassian. The 2 men we identified from the Carver building, they work for Lucien. The street was cold. The store behind him was warm. Upstairs, a 7-year-old boy with pale eyes was doing his homework and didn't know his name was written into a financial empire he'd never heard of. And there were men who had spent years waiting for him to be old enough, and the waiting had just ended. Cassian turned back to the door of the lantern shelf and pushed it open with enough force that the brass bell didn't murmur this time. Alara was already moving when he came back through the door. She had a bag on the counter, Satyam canvas, the kind she carried daily, but she was adding things to it with a speed and selectivity that told him she'd done this before, not recently. But the muscle memory was there, the particular economy of someone who had once known how to disappear and had never entirely forgotten the choreography. How much time do we have? She said without looking up. I don't know. Best guess. If Lucian's people were at the Carver building an hour ago and they found what they were looking for, he crossed the room quickly, went to the window, checked the street. The surveillance vehicles he'd identified yesterday were gone. Both of them. The absence was louder than their presence had been. They're already moving. Alara zipped the bag. She looked at him with an expression that had shed everything except function. Rowan goes first. Whatever else happens, Rowan goes first. Agreed. I have a place. 4 blocks north, above the Portuguese bakery. A woman named Dora. She's kept a room ready for 2 years. She doesn't ask questions. They'll know about Dora. They don't know about Dora. Alara is... I know what they know. Her voice was sharp and flat. I've spent 7 years mapping the edges of whatever this surveillance was. I tested it. 3 times I moved toward people I thought might be contacts. People from before. All 3 times, those people were approached within 48 hours. Dora is someone I met here. After. She exists in no record connected to my previous life. She held his gaze. They don't know about Dora. He looked at her for a moment. He nodded. Go get Rowan. She was already on the stairs. He stood in the empty store and watched the street and listened to the sounds above him. Her voice, low and calm, the particular cadence adults use when they're trying to deliver alarming information to children without the alarm showing through. A pause. Rowan's voice, a question, 2 words he couldn't make out. Her response, longer. Then footsteps. They came down together. Rowan had his school bag and his jacket, and the expression of a child who has been given a partial explanation and is intelligent enough to know it's partial, but has decided, provisionally, to trust the person giving it. He looked at Cassian without surprise and without particular warmth, which was honest and therefore something Cassian found he could work with. He's coming with us? Rowan said. Yes, Alara said. Why? Because he knows things we need to know. Rowan considered this with the seriousness of someone running a cost-benefit analysis. Then he adjusted the strap of his school bag and said, Okay. And that was that. They went out the back. Dora's room was exactly what Alara had described. Small, clean, above a bakery that was shutting down for the evening, accessible through a side entrance that smelled of almond flour and coffee grounds. Dora herself was a compact woman in her 60s with gray hair cut short and the particular stillness of someone who had decided, at some point in her life, that drama was not worth the expenditure. She looked at Cassian once, looked at Alara, looked at Rowan, and said, "Kitchen has food. Don't use the front windows." Then she went back to whatever she'd been doing and did not reappear. Rowan sat at the small table with a glass of water and watched Cassian and Alara. The way children watch adults who are trying to have a conversation in front of them that isn't for them. Tracking the temperature of it, reading the things underneath the words. Cassian called Soto. "Location is clean," Soto said immediately. "No surveillance on the surrounding 3 blocks that I can identify. But the Carver situation has escalated. The 2 men were identified on camera. One of them is a former Meridian operative named Rael. He's been on Lucien's personal payroll for 4 years. What did they take? The filing was accessed and copied. The biometric access protocols, all of them." A pause. "There's more. Tell me." "I went deeper into the Meridian accounts, the expenditure over 7 years. Thus, I found the payroll lines for the surveillance teams, but I also found something else. A separate payment series, much older, starting 9 years ago." Soto's voice dropped slightly. "Cash-in. 9 years ago, Meridian made a payment to a production company, a legitimate company. They do corporate audio work, voice work. The payment reference is coded, but the file name in the archive it's your name." The room went quiet in a specific way that has nothing to do with sound. "A voice recording," Cassian said. "I can't confirm the content without accessing the production company's files. But the timeline fits. 9 years ago. That would be approximately 8 months before Alara Ashcroft left the city." He lowered the phone. He looked at Alara across the small room. She was watching his face, and she had already read enough of it to know. "The recording," she said. "The one in your voice." "Manufactured," he said. "Commissioned. 8 months before they sent someone to your door." He held her gaze. "They were planning it a year in advance, maybe more." Alara sat down on the edge of the bed. She didn't collapse into it. She sat the way people sit when they need a surface because their body is processing something their mind is still catching up to. She put her hands on her knees and she breathed. Rowan said quietly, "Mom." "I'm fine," she said. "I'm fine, baby. Give me a minute." He gave her a minute. He also slid off his chair and came to stand next to her, not touching, just proximate, the way he'd stood in front of her that first night. Not dramatic, just there. A small person declining to leave a larger person alone with something difficult. Cassian watched his son do this and felt something move through him that he had no architecture for. He'd spent 20 years building structures that kept that kind of feeling at a manageable distance. The distance was not currently available. He brought the phone back up. "Soto, I need everything on Lucian Marrow, not the official record, the actual record. Family, history, allegiances before my father. Go back as far as you can go. That'll take time. You have 2 hours." He ended the call. He pulled a chair from the corner and sat down and looked at Alara and said, "Tell me about the man who came to your door 8 years ago. Describe him." She looked up. "Why?" "Because I want to know if I've met him." She thought. 50, maybe? Slight? Gray at the temples? He had a way of standing very still, like he was conserving something. She paused. He smelled like cigarettes and something chemical, like solvent. Did he have a scar? Right jawline, curved. Her eyes sharpened. "Yes." "His name is Rael," Cassian said. "He's the same man who accessed the Carver building today. He's been on Lucien's private payroll for 4 years, which means he was likely on Lucien's private payroll 8 years ago as well, before the official arrangement existed." He paused. "Lucian sent him to you. Lucian made the recording. Lucian built everything that came after." The silence in the room was different now, denser. "Why?" Alara said. The word was stripped of everything except the actual question. "I don't know all of it yet," Cassian said. "But here's what I do know. My father built a financial system. A legacy structure, he called it, which is the kind of language men use when they want what they built to mean something beyond their own lifetime. He hid significant global assets inside it, and he built a lock on those assets that could only be opened by his direct bloodline. He looked at Rowan, who was listening with complete attention and no visible agitation, which was either a sign of remarkable composure or that he was still assembling what he was hearing into something coherent. "Rowan is that bloodline." "Your father knew about Rowan," Alara said. "He must have. He set up the protection. He funded it. He knew." Cassian leaned forward, elbows on knees. "What I don't know is what he told Lucien, or how much Lucien understood. But Lucien has been managing my father's affairs for 30 years. He would have known about the financial structure. He would have understood what it meant. And when my father died," he stopped. "When your father died," Alara said, "Lucien was in a position to inherit the management of those structures. Except he couldn't access them. Not without the biometric key." He exhaled. "So he did what he could. He kept Rowan safe. Not out of decency, but because a dead key opens nothing. He kept you contained, kept you quiet, kept you separate from me so I couldn't start asking questions. And he waited. For Rowan to be old enough," Alara said. It was the same phrase he'd used before, and it landed differently now. Heavier, more specific. "For the protocols to mature," Cassian said. "The filing at the Carver building, the one they access today, it was sealed for 17 years. My father filed it when he built the system. 17 years was the lock term. After that, the biometric access could be executed." He met her eyes. "Rowan turned 7 4 months ago." Alara stared at him. "The lock term is based on age," Cassian said. 7. My father chose 7. I don't know why. Maybe he thought that was old enough for the bloodline to be confirmed. Maybe it was something else. Something personal. But 4 months ago, the lock became executable. And 2 months after that, Lucian's surveillance team that has been watching this building for 7 years changed their rotation. Soto flagged it. They went from passive observation to active monitoring. But Rowan said, "They're watching me because of money." Both adults looked at him. He said it without particular drama, in the tone of someone clarifying a fact they want confirmed. "The money can only be opened by someone in your family. And I'm in your family. So they're watching me because they want the money." Cassian said, "Yes." Rowan looked at him steadily. "That's a bad reason to watch a kid." "It is," Cassian said. Rowan thought about this. Then he picked up his glass of water and drank from it and set it down carefully. "Okay," he said. "So what do we do?" What they did, in the immediate term, was wait for Soto, who arrived at the back entrance of Dora's building at 9:17 in the evening with a courier bag full of documents and the specific look of a man who has been moving fast for 6 hours and has found things he didn't want to find. He spread the documents on the small table. Rowan had been persuaded to sleep in the back room, persuaded not without negotiation, which had involved Alara making certain promises about morning pancakes, and Cassian, to his own surprise, saying, "I'll be here when you wake up," which Rowan had accepted with the evaluative look of someone who was deciding whether to extend provisional credit, and then gone to sleep. Soto said, "Lucian Marrow's real name is Lucian Marek. He was born in a city in Eastern Europe, emigrated at 17. He was recruited by your grandfather's organization at 22, not as support staff, as an intelligence asset. He was already trained. Someone trained him before your grandfather found him." "Who?" Cassian said. "That's where it gets complicated." Soto pointed to a document near the top of the pile. "The organization that trained him doesn't exist anymore, technically, but 20 years ago it was known as the Ventry Group, a private intelligence firm that worked both sides of several significant financial conflicts in the 90s. They specialized in long-term asset management." He paused. "By which I mean they placed people in positions of trust inside target organizations and waited." "Sleeper assets," Alara said. She said it with a flatness that suggested this was not a concept she found surprising, which itself was information. "Long-term sleeper assets," Soto confirmed. "Lucian was placed in your grandfather's organization when he was 22. He has been there ever since, 31 years. He looked at Cassian. "He was there when your father built the legacy structure. He was likely involved in designing parts of it, and he has been waiting for 31 years for the moment when those assets could be accessed. He's not working for himself, Cassian said. No, the Vauntry Group was absorbed 17 years ago by a holding entity called Solace Capital. Solace Capital is, on paper, a legitimate asset management firm. In practice, Soto stopped. He chose his next words carefully. In practice, they are the reason your father built the lock the way he built it. He knew about Solace. He knew Lucien was compromised. He built the biometric system specifically to ensure that if Lucien ever tried to access the assets, he couldn't do it without producing your direct bloodline. Cassian looked at the documents. He thought about his father. The old man, gray and heavy in his last years, making decisions Cassian hadn't been privy to, building structures Cassian hadn't known existed. He had always resented his father's opacity, had always read it as control, as the refusal to fully relinquish authority even as age stripped it away. Now he read it differently. His father had known that Lucien was compromised, had known about Solace, had known he was surrounded. And instead of confronting it, which would have been dangerous, which might have accelerated exactly what he feared, he had built a trap, hidden in the architecture of a legacy system, a system that would only pay out to someone who couldn't be manufactured. His father had known about Rowan and had said nothing because saying something would have made Rowan a target. He'd kept the boy safe the only way he knew how, by keeping him secret, by funding surveillance through channels Lucien couldn't easily trace, by building a lock that required the boy to be alive and present and verified, by making his grandson necessary. Cassian sat with this for a long moment. It was a complicated grief, the kind that has admiration tangled up in it alongside the anger, and he didn't have time for it now, so he set it aside in the particular way he had learned to set things aside. Not forgetting them, just placing them somewhere accessible for later. "Where's Lucien now?" he said. Soto's expression shifted. "That's the other thing." He pulled a document from lower in the pile. At 7:30 this evening, Lucien Marrow left the Marsh Street building. He took a car we don't own to an address in the industrial district. He's been there for 90 minutes. A pause. Cassian. He took 3 men with him, and Rael. What's at that address? A facility. It belongs to, on paper, a logistics company. Soto set the document on the table. But the building has 2 basement levels that aren't on any city filing, and the financial trace on those levels leads back to Solace Capital, Cassian said. Yes. He looked at Alara. She was already looking at him. Her face had gone to a specific place, not fear, but the territory adjacent to it, where the fear has been acknowledged and set aside in favor of what comes next. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. Unknown number. A text. 3 words. I have him. Then a photograph. Rowan. Sitting in a chair in a room that was not the back room of Dora's building. A room with concrete walls and fluorescent lighting. He was holding his school bag in his lap. He was not visibly hurt. He was looking at the camera with an expression that broke something open in Cassian's chest. Not terror, not tears, but the specific closed-off look of a child who has decided that whatever happens, they are not going to give whoever is watching the satisfaction of watching them fall apart. 7 years old. His son. And he was sitting in a concrete room somewhere in the city doing what Cassian himself had done at 7 years old, holding himself together through sheer will in a situation he hadn't chosen. Cassian stood up so fast the chair went back. He's not in the building, Alara said. She was already moving toward the back room, already knowing, her voice having lost all steadiness now, stripped to something raw and operational. She pushed the door open and the back room was empty. The narrow bed, the window latch open, the suggestion of recent occupation. She stood in the doorway of the empty room and her hands went to the doorframe on either side. Cassian came to stand behind her. He looked at the open window, at the perfectly made bed, at the school bag that was not there because Rowan had taken it, which meant he'd gone through the window willingly, or had been moved fast enough that he'd grabbed the one thing he always carried and gone. He looked at the photograph again, Rowan's school bag, in his lap, in a concrete room. He'd taken it because it was his, because it was familiar, Because in a bad situation, you hold on to what is yours. Cassian thought, my father's son, my father's grandson. Elara turned from the empty room. Her eyes were wet, but her jaw was set, and her voice, when it came, was the voice of someone who has moved past what they feel and into what they are going to do. Where is that building? She said. Soto was already pulling up the address. Cassian's phone buzzed again. Same unknown number. This time, no photograph, just text. Come alone. Bring nothing. You have 2 hours. After that, we begin the verification process without waiting for your consent. The boy's blood is sufficient. His consciousness is optional. He read it twice. He read it the way you read something when part of your brain is trying to find a way that the words mean something other than what they say. They meant exactly what they said. He looked at Elara. She had read it over his shoulder. Her face was a thing he had no vocabulary for. He said, come alone, she said. Yes. You're not going alone. Elara, you are not, she said, with a quietness that was more absolute than shouting, going to that building alone. I have been keeping that child alive and safe for 7 years with no help from anyone, and I am not going to stand in a bakery apartment and wait while you... She stopped. She pressed her lips together. She breathed. I know things about the biometric system that you don't. Things I found out before I left. Things I did before I left. Because I was 7 weeks pregnant and terrified, and I needed... She stopped again. I need you to trust me. Right now. Can you do that? He looked at her for a long moment, at the woman who had built a life out of an absence, who had raised his son in a bookstore and taught him to stand in front of people he loved and ask hard questions without flinching. He said, tell me what you know. She told him, and what she told him changed everything. He thought he understood about the trap his father had built, because the trap was not what Lucian believed it was, and the lock was not what the protocols described. And somewhere in the 7 years that Elara Ashcroft had spent in a waterfront bookstore, she had done something extraordinary and quiet and invisible, the way she did most things. She had rewritten the ending. But Lucien had Rowan, and Rowan was in a concrete room, and they had less than 2 hours, and whatever the ending was supposed to be, they had to get there first. Cassian put his phone in his pocket. He looked at Soto. How many people can we move in 2 hours that Lucian doesn't know about? Soto said, enough. Then move them, Cassian said, and get me a map of those basement levels. He looked at Elara. She had already picked up the canvas bag. Soto had the basement schematics on his phone within 12 minutes, pulled from a city infrastructure archive that technically required judicial authorization to access, which was the kind of detail no one in the room was currently concerned with. He laid the phone flat on the table. 2 basement levels. The first was standard, utility corridors, mechanical systems, the bones of a building that had once processed industrial freight. The second level was different, smaller, deliberate. 3 rooms arranged in a sequence that had no logistical purpose and every operational one. The third room, Elara said, pointing. Her finger didn't waver. That's where they'll have him. It's the only space with independent ventilation. They'd need that for the biometric equipment. The air has to be controlled. Cassian looked at her. You've seen equipment like this before. I researched it 7 years ago after I understood what Rowan was. She met his eyes without apology. I needed to know what they'd need to do to him, if they ever came. She looked back at the schematic. The verification process takes approximately 40 minutes if the subject cooperates. If he doesn't, she stopped. Rowan won't cooperate. No, Cassian said. He won't. Which buys us time, but not much. They'll find ways to make cooperation more attractive. Her jaw tightened on the last 3 words in a way that told him exactly what she meant, and that she was not going to say it more plainly, because saying it more plainly was not something she could currently afford to do. Soto said, there's one entry point to the second level, a stairwell from the northeast corner of the first basement, single access. It's a choke point. They'll have it covered, Cassian said. Yes, but the ventilation system connects to the exterior on the building's west side. Independent system, separate intake. It's large enough. He looked at Cassian carefully. for someone who doesn't mind confined spaces. Cassian looked at the schematic, then at Alara. You go through the ventilation. I go through the stairwell. You go through the stairwell, she said, and they will be waiting for you. You'll draw every person in that building to the northeast corner. That's the point. She held his gaze. She understood. She didn't like it, which was visible in the set of her mouth, and the brief, hard exhale through her nose, but she understood it, which was what mattered. When I'm inside, she said, I need 4 minutes, possibly 3. To do what? To do what I did 7 years ago. She held his gaze steadily. Trust me. You said you could. He said, 4 minutes. Soto handed him a small radio, handed a second one to Alara. Channel 3. It'll cut through the concrete. Cassian took the radio. He pocketed it. He looked at the schematic one more time, committing it. The distances, the angles, the 3 rooms in sequence at the bottom of a building where his son was sitting with his school bag in his lap, holding himself together. He picked up his coat. Alara was already at the door. They went out into the city, into the cold, into the 2 hours that remained, and the night received them without ceremony, the way nights receive people who have moved past the point of preparation and into the point of no return, not with drama, not with portent, just with darkness and the sound of their own footsteps and everything they were carrying that had no name. Behind them, in Dora's small kitchen, Soto was already on his phone moving people into position. 12 men who owed their continued employment, and in several cases their continued existence, to the Voss name. Men who did not know the details and did not require them. Cassian walked beside Alara through 3 blocks of quiet street. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to say that was more useful than silence, and they both understood that. At the corner before the industrial district, she stopped. She looked at him with an expression that had shed everything except the essential, not the anger, not the grief, not the 8 years of complicated history compressed between them like sediment. Just the immediate and irreducible fact of 2 people who were about to do something dangerous and needed each other to survive it. She said, Don't die in that stairwell. He said, Don't take longer than 4 minutes. She turned and walked west toward the ventilation intake, her canvas bag on her shoulder, her footsteps steady on the wet pavement. He watched her go for exactly 3 seconds, the duration of something that was not quite a prayer and not quite a promise but occupied the same internal space. And then he turned east toward the building's entrance and began to move. The building had 4 men on the exterior. Cassian counted them from the shadow of a loading dock across the street, his back against cold corrugated steel, his breath shallow and controlled. 2 at the main entrance, a roll door, and a personnel entry side by side, both lit by a single overhead lamp that threw more shadow than light. 1 at the northeast corner, facing the alley, 1 on the roof, moving in a slow patrol arc that brought him to the west edge every 90 seconds. Professional spacing, overlapping sightlines. Someone had set this up who knew what they were doing. He keyed the radio once, a single click, the signal that he was in position. 2 clicks came back. Alara, at the ventilation intake on the west side. He looked at his watch, 11:41. 1 hour and 19 minutes remaining on the deadline Lucien had given him, which meant nothing, because Cassian had no intention of honoring the deadline, and Lucien almost certainly knew that. He moved. He went left, away from the main entrance, using the parked freight containers along the south side of the building as cover. The container steel was cold through his coat when he pressed against it between movements. His left hand, the bandaged one, was functioning well enough, but he could feel the wound pulling when he gripped, a specific complaint that he filed away and ignored. The northeast corner guard was a problem. He was positioned well, back to the building wall, eyes on both the alley and the approach from the south. No obvious angle. Cassian waited. He counted the guard's small movements, the weight shift from left foot to right, the periodic check of a device in his left hand, the slight turn of the head every 30 seconds to check the alley entrance. Patterns. Everyone had patterns. The guard's pattern gave him a 4-second window every minute and a half when his head was turned and his peripheral vision was compromised by the wall corner. Cassian used the window. 4 seconds was enough. The guard went down without sound, controlled, lowered to the ground with the kind of care that had nothing to do with kindness and everything to do with noise management. Cassian took his radio and his keycard and moved to the northeast personnel door. The keycard worked. The door opened inward onto a stairwell, concrete, fluorescent, exactly as the schematic had shown. The smell was industrial cleaner over something older, damper. Below him, 2 flights down, light. He went down. The first basement level was largely open, the utility corridor space Soto had described. Cassian moved through it in the shadow along the east wall, stepping over a cable conduit that crossed the floor at ankle height. Ahead, the stairwell to the second level. 2 men positioned at its base, facing outward. They heard him at the same moment he stopped pretending they wouldn't. What followed was not elegant. It was fast, and it was ugly, and it involved a metal pipe section from the conduit rack that Cassian had picked up on the way through, and his own body used as a blunt instrument in the particular way that only works if you've accepted in advance that you are going to absorb damage in the process of delivering it. He took a hit to the left shoulder that sent a white spike of pain down his arm and momentarily lost the use of that hand. He finished it anyway, because finishing it was the only option that led anywhere useful. He stood in the stairwell entrance breathing hard, his left arm hanging, the 2 guards down behind him. The shoulder wasn't dislocated. He'd had dislocated, and this was different, muscular rather than structural. But it was going to be a problem. He keyed the radio. 2 clicks, 3 clicks back. Alara was inside. He went down the last flight. The second level was exactly 3 rooms. The first was empty. Equipment cases stacked against the wall, the kind used for sensitive electronics transport, several of them open and emptied. They'd already set up. The second room had 2 men in it and a bank of monitors showing camera feeds from throughout the building, including, his stomach tightened, a feed from the room at the end. The third room. Rowan, on a chair, school bag in his lap. Awake. Still. Cassian hit the monitor room fast, using the element of surprise that existed only because the guards on the monitors had been watching camera feeds and not the door. 2 minutes of violence in a small concrete room, after which Cassian stood with his back to the wall next to the door, breathing through his teeth, his left shoulder screaming, his knuckles split on the right hand, blood working its way through the bandage on his left. He looked at the monitor, at his son. Rowan was looking directly at the camera above the door of the third room. Not at the door, at the camera, as if he knew. As if he'd worked out where the lens was and had decided to look at it on the theory that someone who cared about him might be watching. Cassian pressed his palm flat against the monitor for a moment. Then he moved to the third room's door. It was locked from the outside. A keypad. He tried the keycard. Wrong system. He looked at the keypad. 6 digits. He thought about his father, about the age of 7, about the number 17. He typed 170007. The lock released. He pushed the door open. Rowan looked up. He looked at Cassian. He looked at the blood on his hands and the state of his coat, and the way he was holding his left arm slightly away from his body. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "You look bad." "I've looked worse," Cassian said. "Can you walk?" "I'm not hurt." Rowan stood up, school bag over one shoulder, with the efficient movement of a child who has been sitting still for a long time and is very ready to stop. "There were 2 men in here. They left 15 minutes ago. One of them got a call." "From who?" "I don't know, but he looked scared after it." Rowan looked at him steadily. "Where's Mom?" "Coming. We need to move toward her." He crossed the room, crouched down, looked at the boy directly, at the pale eyes. Up close, in the fluorescent light, the resemblance was not just in the color, it was structural. The line of the jaw, the particular set of the brow. 7 years of a face Cassian had not been present to watch develop, arriving all at once. "Are you actually okay?" Rowan looked at him with the evaluating expression that seemed to be his default mode. "I was scared," he said, "but I didn't show them." "No," Cassian said. "I know you didn't." Something moved in the boy's face, brief, quickly managed, but real. He adjusted the strap of his school bag. "Okay," he said. Let's go. They were 2 steps into the corridor when the lights went out. Not a flicker. Complete and immediate. The fluorescence killed at the source. The monitor room dark. Everything dark except the faint emergency strip along the floor edge that threw just enough red-tinted light to see shapes and nothing more. Cassian put his hand on Rowan's shoulder. Stay behind me. Both hands on my coat. Don't let go regardless of what happens. Small hands found the back of his coat and gripped. They moved. The monitor room was empty. The guards were still down. Nothing had changed there. But the stairwell above was no longer unassisted. Cassian heard them before he saw them. 2 sets of footsteps descending fast, and then a third, slower, deliberate. He pulled Rowan back into the monitor room doorway. The footsteps reached the 2nd level. A flashlight beam cut across the stairwell entrance, swept the corridor. Then a voice. Lucian Marrow said, Cassian, I know you're on this level. I'm not going to insult either of us by pretending otherwise. His voice was exactly what it always was. Calibrated. Even. The voice of someone who had practiced for 30 years, the performance of someone who has everything under control because having everything under control was the one thing that kept the whole structure standing. Cassian said nothing. He measured the distance. Stairwell entrance was 12 meters. Lucian had 2 men with him, the flashlight carrier and 1 more in shadow. But the 3rd set of footsteps had stopped somewhere on the stairs. A 3rd man, positioned to cut off retreat. The boy is what I need, Lucian said. He was moving slowly down the corridor, the flashlight beam preceding him. Not you, not Alara, just the boy, for 40 minutes, and then this is finished and everyone walks away. A pause. I have no interest in killing your son, Cassian. I've spent 7 years keeping him alive. You've spent 7 years keeping him available, Cassian said, from the doorway. The flashlight swung toward his voice. He was already moving, not toward the stairwell, but deeper into the monitor room, pulling Rowan with him, putting the equipment bank between them and the door. Semantics, Lucian said. His footsteps reached the monitor room entrance. The flashlight found the downed guards on the floor, swept across the monitors, found Cassian behind the equipment bank. Cassian, be rational. Tell me something. Cassian kept his voice steady. Behind him, Rowan's hands on his coat, absolutely still. The boy had gone so quiet that if not for the physical contact, Cassian might not have known he was there. 30 years. My grandfather, my father, now me. Was any of it real? A silence. The flashlight didn't move. Parts of it, Lucian said. Which parts? Your father... He stopped. Something shifted in the calibrated voice. Not much, just enough to be audible. Your father was extraordinary, you know that. He built something that should not have been possible to build, and he protected it with a level of foresight I genuinely admired. A pause. He was also a man who made his choice, and I made mine, and neither of us ever pretended otherwise. Not to each other. He knew, Cassian said. He knew about you. He knew something was wrong. He didn't know the specifics. Lucian took a step into the room. He built his lock. I adapted my plan accordingly. It's been 30 years of 2 very patient men adjusting to each other's contingencies. Another step. He's gone, Cassian. I'm still here. And the boy is the key. The radio in Cassian's pocket clicked 3 times. Alara, in position. He needed 45 seconds. He said, What does Solace Capital actually want with the assets? Lucian stopped. The question had landed differently than Lucian expected. Cassian could hear it in the brief recalibration of the man's breathing. You know about Solace. I know about Vantry. I know about the placement. I know you've been a sleeper asset for 31 years. Cassian kept his voice even. Behind the equipment bank, he was moving his right hand slowly to the short-range radio in his coat pocket. What I don't know is what they actually want. A criminal financial empire. Why does a firm like Solace Capital want that specific type of asset? Because it's not a criminal financial empire. Lucian's voice had changed. Not the calibration. Something underneath it. something that might have been in a different kind of man, a form of pride. Your father built it as criminal infrastructure, but the underlying assets, the shell structures, the international routing systems, the dark financial pathways, those are worth 10 times the liquid capital to an organization that needs to move resources across jurisdictions without visibility. A pause. Solace doesn't want the money. They want the plumbing. Cassian pressed the radio transmit button 3 times. Went. The lights came back on. Not the fluorescence, something else. Something from the ventilation system access panel in the northeast corner of the monitor room, which swung open at that moment and through which Alara Ashcroft came feet first with a small device in her hand and the expression of someone who has been in confined spaces for 20 minutes and is done with it. She hit the floor. She looked at Lucien. She held up the device. Lucien looked at it. Something left his face. Not fear, more like the departure of a long-held certainty, the specific expression of a man watching a calculation he'd trusted for years return a different result. "That's not possible," he said. "It's a protocol override," Alara said. She was breathing hard, a graze on her left forearm from the ventilation metal, her hair loose and her eyes absolutely clear. "Your biometric system is keyed to Rowan's genetic markers, which you pulled from a medical record. I know which record. I gave it to the facility myself 7 years ago, which means I controlled what they received." She took a breath. "What they received was accurate, but incomplete. The system will verify Rowan's identity correctly. What it will not do is release the assets to the access request you filed. Because 4 years ago I accessed the sealed protocol at the Carver building, not the copy your people accessed today, the original, and I added a secondary authorization layer." Lucien said, "The filing was sealed." "I had help," she said, "from a lawyer who owed a very significant debt to Aldrich Voss and honored it after Aldrich died by honoring it to his family." She held the device steadily. "This device completes that authorization layer. Without it, the system verifies Rowan's identity and then locks permanently. No further access attempts possible. The assets go to a legal trust with a 15-year dissolution timeline." She paused. "Or you step back and we have a different conversation." The 2 men flanking Lucien had their weapons up. Cassian had nothing left that functioned as a weapon except his body, which was already damaged, and the metal shelving bracket he'd worked loose from the equipment bank in the last 40 seconds and was holding out of Lucien's line of sight. Rowan, behind Cassian, had not made a sound. Lucien looked at Alara. He looked at the device. He was doing what he had done for 30 years, calculating, adjusting, finding the angle. His face was still. His hands were still. He was a man who had survived on the quality of his thinking under pressure, and he was thinking now, visibly, the machinery of it almost audible. Then he looked at Cassian. "Call your men off," Cassian said. "Both of them. Right now. And if I don't?" "Then she activates the lock, you get nothing, and we find out how fast my people can reach this building." He held the man's gaze. "Soto has 12 men outside. They've been in position for 22 minutes. The only reason they haven't come in is because I asked them to wait." A beat. "I'm done asking them to wait." Lucien was quiet for a moment that stretched. Then he said to the 2 men, "Lower them." Neither man moved immediately. They looked at each other. One of them, the larger one with the flashlight, looked at Lucien with an expression that was not obedience but assessment, as if he was deciding whether Lucien's instruction was worth following or whether a different calculation had just become operative. Cassian saw it a half-second before it happened, which was enough. The man with the flashlight was not lowering his weapon. He was shifting it, away from Cassian, toward Lucien. Lucien saw it too. The room compressed into a single second that contained too many things. Cassian moving left, pulling Rowan with him, the sharp crack of a weapon that was not the flashlight man's, Lucien going down, not dead but hit, the second guard pivoting, Alara dropping to one knee with the device clutched to her chest, and from the stairwell, the sound of boots. Multiple sets, coming fast, coming down. Soto's voice in the corridor. "Clear!" The flashlight man made a decision in the half-second available to him and made the wrong one. What followed was brief and decisive and involved 4 of Soto's people coming through the monitor room door in rapid sequence. When it was over, 30 seconds that felt structural, load-bearing, the kind of 30 seconds that everything before them leads to and everything after them proceeds from. The room was loud with breathing, and the particular silence after violence that is not actually silence, but the absence of more violence. Lucien was on the floor against the wall. He'd been hit in the upper arm. Not Soto's people, not Cassian. The flashlight man, who was now restrained in the corner, had fired once before being subdued. Whether it had been an attempt to eliminate Lucien or a misfired panic shot, Cassian couldn't immediately determine and didn't immediately care. He turned to Rowan. The boy was standing exactly where he'd been, both hands still gripping the back of Cassian's coat, even though Cassian had moved and the coat had pulled and Rowan had moved with it without releasing, like someone who had decided that the instruction "don't let go" was going to be honored past the point of obvious necessity. He let go now. He looked at his own hands as if slightly surprised to find them empty. He looked at Alara, who crossed the room to him in 4 steps and put her arms around him, and he let her, his face against her shoulder, his school bag still on his back. Cassian watched them. He was bleeding from somewhere new. His side, he thought, from the equipment bank edge when he'd moved, and his left shoulder was a sustained complaint, and his right hand was going to be significantly less functional tomorrow than it was now. He looked at Lucien on the floor. Lucien looked back at him. His face had finally lost its arrangement. Not broken. People like Lucien didn't break in the way that word usually implies. But uncovered. The 30-year performance of control, stripped back to whatever was underneath it, which turned out to be simply a man, aging, bleeding, sitting on a concrete floor in a basement that hadn't worked out the way he'd planned. He said, "The device." His voice was still even. "She'll use it." "Yes," Cassian said. "The assets will be locked. Everything your father built." "I know." Lucien looked at him. "You're not going to try to stop her." "No," Cassian said. "I'm not." Something moved through Lucien's face. It might have been, in a very different context, something close to respect. "You're more like your father than you know," he said. "I know," Cassian said. "I'm starting to think that's not entirely a bad thing." He looked at Alara. She was still holding Rowan. Over the boy's shoulder, she met Cassian's eyes, and she held up the device, and she looked at him with a question in her face that was not really a question. She already knew the answer. She was simply giving him the form of the choice. He nodded. Her thumb moved on the device. The sound it made was almost nothing, a small electronic tone, the kind a phone makes when a message sends, the kind of sound entirely disproportionate to what it meant. Somewhere above them, in a sealed filing in a Cayman Islands server, a 15-year lock clicked into place over the financial architecture of 30 years of Voss Empire. And in the 3rd room of the 2nd basement level of a building in the industrial district, with blood on the floor and Soto's people filling the corridor and a 7-year-old boy pressing his face into his mother's shoulder, Cassian Voss stood with his damaged hands at his sides and felt, for the first time in longer than he could accurately measure, that he was standing on something that might eventually become solid ground. Lucien said from the floor, "It's not over." Cassian looked at him. "Solace Capital is not an organization that accepts this kind of outcome and moves on," Lucien said. His voice had found a new register, not threat, not performance. Something closer to warning, which from this man in this moment carried a different weight. "They will send someone else." "I know," Cassian said. "Then you know this doesn't end here." "No," Cassian said. "It ends here for you." He looked at Soto in the doorway. "Get him medical. Then get him somewhere appropriate until we decide what appropriate means long term." He looked back at Lucien. "And get me Rael. Wherever he went when he left this building, I want him found." Soto nodded and began issuing instructions, and the room began to move with the purposeful choreography of people who know what comes next. Cassian walked to where Alara and Rowan were standing. Rowan had lifted his head from his mother's shoulder. He looked at Cassian with those pale eyes in that fluorescent light, and he looked at the blood and the damage and the general state of a man who had gone through something difficult to get to a basement room, and he said, with the directness that seemed to be simply how he was built, "Are you going to be okay?" Cassian looked at his son. "Ask me again in the morning," he said. Rowan considered this. Then he nodded, apparently finding it an acceptable answer, and reached out and took Cassian's right hand, the less damaged one, and held it, not tightly, just held it, the way a child holds the hand of someone they have provisionally decided they are not yet ready to let go of, and Cassian held on back. Elara watched them. She didn't say anything. She pressed her lips together and looked at the ceiling for a moment, the way people do when they are managing something that would otherwise show on their face, and then she looked back down and she put her hand on Cassian's arm, not his damaged shoulder, the other one, and she said, "Let's get our son out of this basement." Our son. 2 words she had never said to him before. Cassian tightened his grip on Rowan's hand and they walked toward the stairs together. The night air hit them at the top of the stairwell like something earned. Rowan didn't let go of Cassian's hand until they reached the street, and even then it was a gradual release, fingers loosening by degrees, the way a person wakes from sleep, not all at once but in stages, each one a small negotiation with consciousness. When his hand was finally free, he put it in his jacket pocket and walked between Cassian and Elara with the quiet self-containment of a child who has decided that what happened tonight is something he will process on his own timeline, in his own interior, and that no adult is going to rush that process. Soto had vehicles on the south side of the building. They moved toward them through cold air that smelled of the river and diesel and the particular emptiness of industrial streets after midnight. 2 of Soto's men flanked them, without being asked, falling into position with the practiced ease of people who understood that the work was not finished simply because the immediate danger had been managed, because it hadn't been. Cassian knew that. Lucien's warning from the basement floor was not posturing, it was information. Solace Capital was real, its interests in the Voss financial architecture were real, and the lock Elara had activated would not make those interests disappear. It would redirect them, complicate them, force a recalculation. But organizations like Solace did not dissolve when a plan failed. They adapted. They found new angles. They sent different people. Cassian would need to be ready for that. But not tonight. Tonight had its own requirements, and the first of them was getting his son somewhere warm. Soto had arranged a safe house in the north of the city, an apartment on the 7th floor of a residential building, the kind of building where nobody looked at their neighbors in the elevator and nobody answered questions from strangers at the door. Clean lines, functional furniture, windows that overlooked a street that was quiet at this hour and would be busier by morning, which was useful for cover. Elara got Rowan settled in the back bedroom within an hour. Cassian stood in the kitchen with Soto and let a man named Pryor, who had apparently been waiting in the building lobby with a medical kit because Soto planned for these eventualities, work on his shoulder and his side and his hands without doing Cassian the discourtesy of commenting on the extent of the damage. The shoulder was muscular, as he'd assessed, badly bruised, possibly a minor tear. The side wound was a graze from the equipment bracket, long and shallow, the kind that looked worse than it was, but would make certain movements unpleasant for 2 weeks. The hands were the hands. Pryor cleaned them, closed what needed closing, and moved on. Soto waited until Pryor had packed up and left before saying, "Rael, tell me." He was picked up at the Eastern Freight Terminus 40 minutes ago. He'd been trying to arrange transport out of the city. Soto's voice was neutral in the way it got when he was delivering information he considered significant and was leaving the significance for Cassian to assign. He had documents on him, physical copies. He was clearly planning on the digital systems being compromised. What kind of documents? Communications between Lucien and Solace Capital, going back 11 years. Soto set a folder on the kitchen counter. It's comprehensive. Names, account structures, the full chain of instruction from Solace through Lucien into the Voss organization. Every operation Lucien ran on their behalf. He paused, including the original order for the voice recording, dated, signed, in the sense that Lucien used an identifier that traces back to him unambiguously. Another pause. And an order from 9 years ago for the elimination of a target identified only as Asset 7. Cassian looked at the folder without opening it. Elara. The order was issued. It was never executed. The record shows it was countermanded 3 days after issuance. Soto looked at him carefully. The countermand came from your father. The kitchen was quiet. The building settled around them. Somewhere in the back bedroom, Cassian's son was sleeping or trying to, and the woman who had kept him alive for 7 years was sitting on the edge of a bed in a safe house listening to her child breathe. Cassian's father had issued no such countermand. He hadn't known about Asset 7, but someone had filed it under his identifier, which meant someone inside the structure had used Aldrich Voss's credentials to pull back an order that would have killed Alara Ashcroft 9 years ago. Someone who had access to those credentials. Someone who had been in the organization for 30 years. Lucien countermanded his own order, Cassian said. Soto said nothing, which was confirmation. He sent her away, Cassian said. He built the fiction, he manufactured the recording, he drove her out. But when the order came through to eliminate her, he pulled it back. He looked at the folder. Why? That, Soto said, I don't have an answer for. The documentation doesn't explain the motivation. Cassian stood with that for a moment. He thought about what Lucien had said in the basement. Parts of it were real. And about the specific, almost imperceptible shift in the man's voice when he'd mentioned Cassian's father. 30 years was a long time to be one thing while pretending to be another. Long enough for the pretending to develop its own complicated grain. He didn't have a clean read on it. He wasn't sure a clean read was available or necessary. What he had was the fact of it, that Lucien had protected Alara from the order he himself had generated, which meant that somewhere in the architecture of his betrayal, there had been a limit, a line he hadn't crossed. And that was not exoneration, but it was something, some human thing that defied the clean narrative of a man who was simply an instrument of external interests. He closed the folder. The documents go to the appropriate authorities, he said. All of them. Lucien, Solace, the full structure. Not through our channels, through legitimate channels. Legal counsel. Law enforcement contacts who are clean. I want this on record in places that can't be made to disappear. Soto raised an eyebrow slightly. This was not historically how the Voss organization handled its complications. Things are changing, Cassian said. He said it simply, without announcement, the way you state something that has already been decided. Start the process tonight. What? He sat outside Rowan's door for a while after Soto left, not guarding it. The building was secure. Soto's people were on the exits. There was nothing immediate to guard against. Just sitting. A chair from the hallway, positioned at an angle where he could see both the door and the window at the end of the corridor. His shoulder ached. His hands ached. The graze on his side pulled every time he breathed too deeply, which meant he was breathing carefully, which felt, in a strange way, appropriate for what he was doing. Alara came out of the room at 2:15. She saw him in the chair and stopped. She looked at him for a moment without speaking, the particular look of someone who has prepared themselves for an empty hallway and found it occupied. She leaned against the doorframe. He's asleep. Good. She looked at the chair, at the angle he'd positioned it. You've been sitting here since Soto left. Yes. She didn't tell him he didn't need to. He appreciated that. She understood, or she was too tired to argue it, or both. She slid down the door frame until she was sitting on the floor with her back against it, knees up, arms resting on them. It was an ungraceful position, and she didn't seem to care. There were scratches on her left forearm from the ventilation shaft, and a bruise forming along her jawline that Cassian didn't know the origin of and filed in the category of things to ask about when the immediate had cleared enough space for the secondary. The device, he said. The secondary authorization layer. When did you actually do it? 4 years ago. I told you a lawyer helped. His name was Greer. He'd handled some of your father's most sensitive filings. After Aldrich died, he contacted me. He'd been instructed to, if anything happened to Aldrich. She looked at the end of the corridor. Your father left him a letter, explaining what he knew about Lucien, explaining the lock, and asking him, if the opportunity arose, to help me add the secondary layer. A pause. He said your father had been watching me for 3 years before he died. He knew where I was. He knew about Rowan. He never made contact because he believed contact would compromise our safety. She paused again. He also said to tell you, and this is a direct quote from the letter, tell my son that I knew, and I'm sorry I couldn't do it differently, and Rowan has his grandfather's hands. Cassian looked at the floor. He stayed looking at the floor for a while. The building continued settling. Somewhere below, a door opened and closed. "He could have told me," Cassian said. His voice came out quieter than he intended. "Any point in 4 years. He could have told me. He thought it was safer if you didn't know. If you were genuinely uninformed, Lucian had no reason to move against you. The moment you knew about Rowan, you became a threat to Lucian's timeline." She looked at him. "He was protecting you, badly, and without your consent, and in a way that cost you 7 years of your son's life. But that's what he was doing." "I know," Cassian said. "That doesn't make it—" "No," Alara said. "It doesn't." They sat with that. The hallway held the silence between them, and the silence was not comfortable, but it was honest, which was better. "What happened to Greer?" Cassian said. "He died 8 months ago. Natural causes. He was 81. A beat. "He made sure the filing was registered before he died. It's on record. Whatever Solace tries to do legally, they'll find the lock is airtight." She looked at her hands. "He was a good man. He was frightened of what he was involved in, and he helped anyway. That counts for something." "It counts for a lot," Cassian said. 3 weeks later, Cassian sat across from a federal prosecutor named Vasquez in a conference room on the 19th floor of a building downtown, with his legal counsel beside him and the Rael documents on the table between them. The meeting lasted 4 hours. He answered every question without deflection, without the kind of strategic vagueness that had historically characterized the Voss organization's interactions with law enforcement. He named names, he traced structures, he provided account numbers and routing pathways, and the specific operational details of 11 years of Solace Capital's infiltration of his organization. It was not comfortable. It was not complete protection from consequences. Vasquez made clear that certain elements of the Voss organization's own history would be subject to review, which Cassian had expected and had communicated to his counsel he was prepared to address. Accountability was not a word Cassian had historically applied to himself or his family's operation. He was applying it now, imperfectly, with limits, but genuinely. 2 Solace Capital executives were arrested in separate jurisdictions within 6 weeks of the Vasquez meeting. 3 shell companies were frozen. The Meridian consulting structure was dismantled by a joint task force whose existence Cassian had quietly facilitated through channels he had spent 30 years building and was now spending on something other than the purposes they were built for. Lucian Marrow cooperated. That was the word the lawyers used, cooperated, which in practice meant that Lucian, sitting in a facility that was considerably more functional than a basement room but had similar limits on egress, looked at the evidence against him and made the calculation he had always made, the one that had kept him alive and operational for 30 years. What is the best available outcome from where I'm standing right now? The best available outcome involved telling Vasquez's team everything he knew about Solace Capital's operations across 4 continents. It was significant information. It was, in the assessment of people who tracked these things professionally, some of the most comprehensive intelligence on private financial interference that had been produced in a decade. Cassian did not attend any of those proceedings. He had delivered what he had to deliver. What happened next was for other people to manage. He was busy with other things. Rael was a different matter. Rael had spent 40 years doing the specific kind of work that Lucian had directed him to do, and he had done it without the complicated interior life that had led Lucian to countermand an elimination order 9 years ago. Rael was an instrument that had never developed opinions about its use. The documents he'd been carrying at the freight terminus were his exit strategy, his own insurance, compiled over years, the kind of leverage a careful man builds against the possibility that the people employing him will eventually find him expendable. That leverage was now in Vasquez's hands along with everything else. Rael's current location was a question Cassian did not ask, and Soto did not answer, which was its own kind of answer, and Cassian accepted it with the understanding that some things were going to change, and some things were going to change more slowly, and the specific geography of that line was something he was going to have to keep locating and relocating for the rest of his life. He was prepared for that. He thought he was, anyway. Preparation and readiness are different things, and he was honest enough with himself to know he didn't always know which one he had until the moment arrived. Rowan asked about his grandfather in the fourth week. They were in the bookstore. The lantern shelf had been closed for 3 weeks after the night in the basement, a precaution that Ilara had agreed to with less argument than Cassian expected, which told him how much that night had recalibrated her sense of what was worth fighting about. Now it was open again, and Cassian had developed a habit of arriving an hour before closing and staying until Rowan was in bed. A habit that had not been formally discussed or agreed upon, but had established itself through repetition, the way habits do when nobody objects to them. He was shelving returns. Ilar had given him this task with the air of someone finding a use for an available resource. When Rowan appeared at his elbow and said, "What was he like?" Cassian looked down. "Who?" "My grandfather." Rowan was carrying a book he'd been reading, one finger holding his place. "You said he knew about me. I want to know what he was like." Cassian set down the book he was holding. He crouched to eye level, which had become his standard practice when talking to Rowan. Not because the boy required it, but because Cassian had found it mattered to him, to be at the same level, to not conduct these conversations from above. "He was complicated," Cassian said. "Everyone says that about people when they don't want to say something bad." Cassian looked at his son. "You're right. He was difficult. He made decisions that hurt people because he believed the outcome justified it. He kept secrets when he should have shared them. He loved his family in a way that was real, but that didn't always look like love from the outside." He paused. He built things that were meant to last, and when he realized those things were threatened, he protected them the best way he knew how. It wasn't always the right way, but it was what he had. Rowan considered this with the seriousness he brought to everything. "Did you love him?" "Yes," Cassian said, without hesitation, even when he made it complicated too. Rowan looked at the book in his hand. He opened it to his held page, looked at it, closed it again. "Okay," he said. Then he went back to his reading corner, and Cassian stood up and went back to shelving, and the store moved around them with its amber light and its old paper smell and its quiet that had become, over 4 weeks of slow accumulation, something Cassian recognized as his. Ilara told him, on a Tuesday evening in the 6th week, that she'd been contacted by Greer's firm, the law office that had survived Greer himself. The 15-year trust that held the locked Voss assets had been formally registered. A board of 3 independent trustees would manage the dissolution over the trust term, with the proceeds at the end directed to a series of legitimate charitable and business entities that Greer had helped design before he died. "It's clean," she said. They were in the back room after closing, the one that smelled of coffee, and had a table covered in book catalogs and a small electric heater that worked intermittently. "Legally airtight. Solace can challenge it and they won't get anywhere. The secondary authorization makes the original filing uncontestable." She looked at him across the table. "It's over, financially, structurally. The empire your father built, it's going to spend 15 years becoming something else." Cassian looked at the table. At a catalog for a small press that published translated fiction, which Ilara had been marking up before he arrived. Red pen, small precise notations in the margins. "I know," he said. "Does that—" She stopped. She started again. "Is that something you can live with?" He looked at her. She was asking an honest question and deserved an honest answer, which required him to actually locate the answer rather than produce the one that sounded correct. "My father spent his life building that structure," he said. "He believed it was a legacy. Something that would last. Something that would protect the family beyond his own lifetime." He paused. "What it actually did was make my son a target before he was born. It kept you running for 7 years. It gave Lucien something worth betraying everyone for." He looked at the catalog with its red margin notes. "If it becomes something that funds a children's hospital or a scholarship or 100 small things that don't require anyone to be afraid, yeah, I can live with that." Ilara looked at him. Then she looked down at the catalog and made another small notation. "There are 2 legitimate businesses," she said, "already generating revenue. A shipping logistics company and a property management group, both structured cleanly. They'll be transferred out of the trust into direct ownership before the dissolution begins." She paused. They're being transferred to you. He blinked. I didn't know about that. Greer arranged it. Your father specified it. The trust isolates the problematic assets. The infrastructure Solace wanted. The clean businesses transfer to you directly. She looked up. Your father wanted you to have something that didn't require an apology to hold. Cassian sat with that for a long moment. The heater ticked. Outside, the waterfront street moved through its evening in the usual way. Foot traffic thinning, the bakery next door going dark, the clock shop's sign clicking off. He was still making decisions on my behalf without telling me, Cassian said. Yes, Alara said. He was. A beat. But this one's different. He thought about it. He thought about a man who had built an empire and watched it get compromised and spent his last years constructing a trap for the person who'd compromised it and a safety net for the people he was trying to protect, all in secret, all without asking anyone's permission or consent. Because that was simply how he had operated for 71 years, and you do not change the fundamental structure of how you move through the world in the last chapter. You leave what you can. You hope it's enough. You don't get to know if it was. Okay, Cassian said. Tell Greer's firm okay. Alara made a note. The renovation of the lantern shelf took 6 weeks. Cassian had offered to fund it, and Alara had declined twice and accepted on the third offer, which he understood to be the correct number of times to offer a thing before it became pressure. The work was done by a contractor Alara chose. On a timeline Alara managed, with aesthetic decisions made entirely by Alara and Rowan, who turned out to have strong and compatible opinions about what a bookstore should look like, and communicated them to the contractor with a directness that made the man look slightly startled. Cassian showed up on Saturdays. He moved things when asked. He made coffee. He drove Rowan to his weekend football practice. Rowan played with the singular committed aggression of someone who had inherited certain temperamental qualities and found in sports a legitimate outlet for them, which Cassian watched from the sideline with an expression that several of the other parents correctly identified as pride, but were too polite to mention. He did not move in. That was not a conversation that had been had, and he did not force it. There was a distance between what existed and what might eventually exist, and that distance was real and required respect. Alara was not a woman who moved quickly toward anything simply because the circumstances that had previously prevented it had changed. She had rebuilt her life once from almost nothing, and she was not going to absorb someone into it until she was sure of the terms. He understood that. He was learning, slowly, to understand a great many things he had previously moved past too quickly to register. The reopening was on a Thursday. A small sign in the window. No announcement beyond the neighborhood's own informal communication system, which turned out to be fairly efficient because by noon there were enough people in the store to make the space feel warm in a way that had nothing to do with the new heating system Alara had finally replaced. Rowan worked the front table, organizing a display of new arrivals with the focused attention he brought to tasks he considered important. He had informed the contractor, during the renovation, that the front table needed to be exactly 32 inches high, because that was the height at which he could work comfortably, and the contractor had built it to 32 inches without comment, and now Rowan stood behind it with the proprietary air of someone operating in their correct domain. Cassian arrived at 11. He came in through the front door, which was propped open for the first time since the incident, and the bell above the door made its soft brass murmur, and Rowan looked up and said, "You're late," without particular accusation, just as information. "I had something to do first," Cassian said. He had a book in his hand, a paperback, the spine worn, the cover soft with age. He'd had it for 20 years, had found it in a used shop when he was 18 and had carried it through more addresses and circumstances than most objects survive. He'd given it to Alara once, a long time ago, in a different life. She'd left it behind when she left, and he'd taken it back without knowing why. And it had traveled with him for 8 years as a kind of wound he pressed on occasionally to confirm it still hurt. He walked to the front shelf, the one Alara had positioned near the door, visible from the street, the one that held the books she most wanted people to see first. He set the paperback on the shelf. Alara came out of the back room carrying a box of orders. She stopped when she saw him. She looked at the book on the shelf. She looked at him. She set the box down. She crossed the room and picked up the book and looked at it for a moment. At the worn spine, the soft cover, the particular physical history of something that had been held many times by people who found it worth returning to. She turned it over. She looked at the back. She looked at the first page, which had something written in it in a handwriting that was 20 years younger than the hand that had set it on the shelf. She closed it. She held it against her chest for a moment with her eyes closed. Then she opened her eyes and looked at him. And what was in her face was not a simple thing. It was not the resolved, completed emotion of a story that has reached its ending neatly. It was the complicated, weathered, real thing that exists between two people who have been through enough together to know that what they're building now is not the same as what they had before, that it will be harder and more cautious and less innocent, and that it might, precisely because of that, be more durable. She said, "It's a good book." He said, "I know. I've been carrying it for 8 years." She looked at him. She was almost smiling. It was the kind of almost smile that is more expressive than a full one because it contains everything the full smile would simplify. She put the book back on the shelf. She went back to her box of orders. Cassian stood in the amber light of the lantern shelf on its reopening day, surrounded by the smell of old paper and coffee and the low warmth of a small business receiving the people who had made it part of their lives. And he watched his son rearrange the front table display with decisive precision. And he thought about his father, and about 30 years of a man maintaining a fiction, and about the specific cost of secrets kept in the name of love. He thought about Alara filing documents 4 years ago in a law office with a man who was frightened and helped anyway. He thought about a small boy holding his hand in a fluorescent basement. He thought about the weight of a paperback traveling through 8 years of wrong turns. He thought, here, this is the thing, not the empire, not the structure, not the legacy in the sense his father had understood that word. This, the bell above the door and the worn book on the front shelf, and the boy who asked hard questions without flinching, and the woman who had rebuilt herself from nothing and was, cautiously, making room. This was the thing worth protecting. He found a chair near the back. He sat down. He picked up a book from the nearest shelf without checking the title and opened it and did not read it, just held it, just occupied the space, just was present in the way he was learning, slowly and imperfectly, to be present. Outside, the waterfront went on being itself. The bakery opened. The clock shop's sign came on. The street received the day with the unhurried acceptance of a neighborhood that has seen a great deal and expects to see more, and finds, in that continuity, something close to peace. Inside the lantern shelf, the bell above the door murmured every few minutes as people came in, and Rowan worked his table, and Alara moved through the space she had built, and Cassian sat in the back with an unread book in his damaged hands, and none of it was easy, and none of it was clean, and it was every imperfect, complicated, hard-won inch of it enough. The first customer to ask Rowan for a recommendation was a woman in her 70s with silver hair and a canvas tote bag that had seen considerable use. She stood at the front table, looked at the display Rowan had arranged, and said, "I want something that doesn't end the way I expect it to." Rowan looked at her with the evaluating expression that was simply how his face worked when he was taking something seriously. He thought for a moment. Then he went to the third shelf on the east wall, came back with a book, and handed it to her without ceremony. She read the back. She read the first page. She looked at him over the top of it. "How old are you?" "7," Rowan said. "And you've read this?" "Mom read it to me. It ends differently than you think it will." He paused. "In a good way." The woman bought the book. She also bought 2 others, because Alara appeared at the right moment with 2 additional suggestions, and the 3 of them had a conversation about endings that lasted 15 minutes and drew in another customer who had been browsing nearby and found himself unable to stay out of it. Cassian watched this from his chair. He watched the way Alara moved through the store, the particular ease of someone operating in their correct domain, the way Rowan had looked operating behind his table. The same ease, expressed differently. Same source. He thought 7 years. 7 years she had built this alone, and it was not a provisional thing or a hiding place or a compromise. It was a life fully realized, rooted in a neighborhood that had made room for her and the small, serious boy who recommended books to strangers, with the confidence of someone who has no reason to doubt his own judgment. He had arrived into the middle of that life like something thrown through a window. He was aware of that. He was aware that his presence here was not simply addition, it was disruption, even now, even with the danger resolved, even with Lucien in a facility and Solace Capital being dismantled one legal proceeding at a time. He was a man with a history. The history did not disappear because its most immediate consequences had been addressed. He was going to have to earn this. Not once. Continuously. That was the honest shape of it. He was prepared to do that. He thought he was, and he was also honest enough to know that thinking you are prepared and being prepared are different things, and the difference only reveals itself in the actual living of it, day by day, in the small choices that don't feel significant until you look back at them from a distance and see the shape they made. Soto came by at 2 in the afternoon. He didn't come inside. He stopped at the open door, caught Cassian's eye, gave the small nod that meant nothing urgent, just information. Cassian excused himself and stepped outside. The Solace Capital legal proceedings, Soto said. He was wearing a coat that was slightly too light for the weather, which was the only concession his appearance ever made to imperfection. 2 more executives identified in the second jurisdiction. The task force wants a follow-up meeting next week. Set it up. The shipping company and the property group. The transfer documents are ready for signature. Council says it can be completed by end of week if you want to move fast. End of next week, Cassian said. There's no rush. Soto noted this without comment. There had been a time, not long ago, when Cassian's default on any business matter was to move as fast as the structure permitted. Soto had observed the shift without naming it, which was characteristic of him. The Marsh Street building, Soto said. The operational center. What do you want to do with it? Cassian looked at the street, at the waterfront neighborhood doing its Thursday business, at the clock shop sign, at the bakery with its window full of something that smelled, even from here, like cardamom. Sell it, he said, legitimately. Have council identify an appropriate buyer, something that will actually use the space, not another shell. Soto looked at him steadily. That's the last significant operational asset. I know. After that, Cassian said, there isn't an organization. There are 2 legitimate businesses, a legal team, and whatever I decide to do next. He looked at Soto. You'll have options. Everyone will have options. Good ones. I'll make sure of that. But the structure is done. Soto was quiet for a moment. Not surprised. Cassian had the sense that Soto had seen this coming and had simply been waiting for it to be said aloud. Understood, he said. I mean it about the options, Cassian said. 11 years. That counts. I know you mean it, Soto said. Something in his voice was different. Not emotional exactly, but less managed, more like the voice of a person rather than an instrument. For what it's worth, I think it's the right call. Cassian looked at him. It's worth something, he said. Soto left. Cassian stood on the pavement for a moment longer, his hands in his coat pockets, his face in the thin autumn sun. The shoulder ached. The side pulled when he breathed too deeply. His hands, wrapped in Pryor's careful work, felt stiff and foreign, like borrowed tools. He breathed anyway. Deeply. Let it pull. He went back inside. At 4:30, Rowan finished his shift at the front table. He had apparently decided that running a bookstore involved shifts, and that his shift ended at 4:30, and that this was not negotiable, and came to sit in the chair adjacent to Cassian's. He had the book he'd been reading earlier. He opened it to his held page. They sat in companionable silence for a while, Rowan reading and Cassian not reading, and both of them occupying the same space in a way that had, over 6 weeks, developed its own comfortable grammar. Rowan asked questions when he had them, and was quiet when he didn't, and did not perform either the questions or the quiet. And this quality, the absence of performance, was something Cassian recognized and valued in a way he didn't have clean words for. After a while, Rowan said, without looking up from his book, "Are you going to live here?" Cassian looked at him. "Here in the store?" "Here." Rowan made a small gesture that encompassed, apparently, the general vicinity. The store, the neighborhood, the life. "Around." Cassian thought about how to answer that honestly without promising a shape for the future he couldn't guarantee. That's what I'm hoping for, he said. If your mom is okay with it, if you're okay with it. Rowan turned a page. I'm okay with it, he said, flatly, factually, the way he said most things. You make good coffee and you know where things go on the shelves. A beat. And you came to the basement. I did, Cassian said. Rowan turned another page. That matters, he said, and went back to reading as if the thing had been settled, which perhaps it had. Alara locked the front door at 6. She turned the sign. She stood with her back to the door for a moment and looked at the store. The new paint, the reorganized shelves, the front table her son had arranged and rearranged 4 times this week in pursuit of some ideal geometry only he could see. The amber light, still amber, unchanged by anything that had happened because some things persist across the destruction of others, and the light in this store was one of them. She looked at Cassian in the back chair. He looked back at her. She said, "Stay for dinner." It was not a complicated invitation. It was not a declaration or a resolution. It was a woman who was learning, slowly and on her own terms, to make room, and it was a specific and ordinary and sufficient form of beginning. He said, "I'll stay." Rowan appeared from the back room where he'd gone to deposit his book, already talking about what he wanted for dinner, already moving toward the stairs that led to the apartment above the store, already assuming, with the unself-conscious certainty of a 7-year-old who has decided something is simply true, that the people behind him were following. They were. Cassian followed Alara up the stairs into the apartment above the lantern shelf, into the smell of cooking and the sound of Rowan opening the refrigerator and the ordinary, irreplaceable, hard-won life that had been built here in his absence, and that was, cautiously and imperfectly, and with no guarantees, beginning to make room for him. The store sat quietly below them. The bell above the door was still. The worn paperback stood on the front shelf where he had placed it, its soft cover catching the last of the amber light, and outside the waterfront street moved through its evening, unhurried, unchanged, the same street it had always been, indifferent to the wreckage of the past, patient with the uncertain work of what came next.